It is December 9th, and 166 years ago today, a famous poet published for the first time one of his most famous poems. This poem is particularly important to me. It's one of my favorites. It's one of the things that in me spurred a lifelong love of history. It's a dramatic telling of an event that, were it not for this poem, might be nearly forgotten. It's part of a nearly forgotten war. And this poem had such an impact on me as a youth that, to tell the truth, I can't remember when I memorized this poem. I simply can't remember a time when I could not recite it from memory. But it's strange, since this poem was so popular, that the poet himself seemed somewhat embarrassed of it. In fact, when he initially published it, he didn't even sign his name to it. The poem and the poet who wrote it have come to be representative of an enigmatic era and a life full of contradictions. The life of Alfred, Lord Tennyson, and his great poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, deserves to be remembered. To understand Alfred Tennyson and his poetry, you have to go back a generation. His grandfather, George Tennyson, was a prominent attorney in Lincolnshire. He had married into the family of a wealthy merchant, and he had ambitions of establishing his family among the aristocracy. George Clayton Tennyson, born in 1778, was the third child and oldest male of George Tennyson's 4 children. The birth of a son might seem auspicious for an ambitious 18th century middle-class Briton who was hoping to move into the aristocracy, but George Clayton Tennyson was almost immediately sent away to be raised by relatives. It isn't clear why George Clayton was sent away, but some historians suggest that he may have been sickly, some suggesting that he even suffered from epilepsy, a neurological disorder that carried a strong stigma at the time, and in fact continues to carry some stigma today. But in a very peculiar move for the time, George Tennyson passed over his oldest son and gave the bulk of his inheritance to his younger son, Charles. Several reasons have been speculated for why George Tennyson decided to pass over his oldest son. Some historians suggest there might have been some sort of altercation between them. Others say that the elder Tennyson might have seen some sort of weakness of temperament in his son. Hallam Tennyson, who's the grandson of George Clayton Tennyson and the son of the poet, says it was simply a caprice of his great-grandfather. George Clayton Tennyson was pressed into a career in the clergy and given a comfortable position as a rector, as his grandson explained, as compensation for being disinherited. This would have various effects on the formative years for Alfred Tennyson, the fourth of George Clayton Tennyson's 12 children. While the family was not poor, and in fact described as comfortably well off for a country clergyman, they did struggle, especially compared to their uncle, and his grandson noted, "Undoubtedly the disinheritance of my grandfather created a feeling of injustice in his mind, which descended to his sons." Despite attaining a great deal of fame in his lifetime, Alfred Tennyson constantly struggled with money. Glenn Everett, an associate professor of English at the University of Tennessee, noted in 2004, "The contrast of his own family's relatively straitened circumstances to the great wealth of his Aunt Elizabeth Russell and Uncle Charles Tennyson, who lived in castles, made Tennyson feel particularly impoverished and led him to worry about money all his life." And this was more than just tension over finance. While Alfred was said to be good friends with his cousins, his uncle's son, the relationship between he and his uncle was strained. A man of social pretensions, Charles Tennyson perceived his family to be socially superior to his brother's family, and he became very jealous of Alfred Tennyson's later success. He once described Tennyson's poetry as a discredit to British taste. George Clayton, while somewhat successful in the clergy, had, according to his grandson, no real calling for the clergy. Emily, Alfred's wife, later recalled, "This preyed upon his nerves and his health and caused much sorrow in his house." The minister eventually suffered from both bouts of depression and alcoholism. He was later described as violent and often drunk. Whether his father had foreseen these weaknesses and they were the cause of his disinheritance, or whether they were the result of his bitterness over it, George Clayton Tennyson raised a family in which mental instability and addiction accompanied brilliance. While his brothers, Frederick and Charles, would also publish and gain some notoriety as poets, many of the Tennyson siblings suffered from addictive personalities, succumbing to alcoholism or opium addictions, as well as melancholy, which Alfred called fits of gloomy despondency. One of the brothers, Edward, would be diagnosed with incurable mental illness and spent 57 years in institutions. Alfred was not immune, saying that as a youth he would feel moods of misery unutterable. Even as he gained fame, Alfred feared that he might succumb to the affliction so common among his siblings. His upbringing and childhood, of which he said, "In my youth I knew much greater unhappiness than I have known later in life," showed in recurring themes in his work. Break, break, break. at the foot of thy crags, O sea, but the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. Break, 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 1835. Still, his father was described as a brilliant man who tried his hand with fair success in architecture, painting, music, and poetry, and who carefully attended to the education and training of his children. While the Tennysons attended school, they were largely taught by their father, of which Alfred said that he himself received a good, but not a regular, classical education. Hallam also said of his father and uncles that the boys had one great advantage, the run of their father's excellent library. Alfred showed poetic tendencies from a young age. He once recalled, "Before I could read, I was in the habit on a stormy day of spreading my arms to the wind and crying out, 'I hear a voice that's speaking in the wind.'" In his biography of his father, Hallam Tennyson quoted a fragment of a poem that Alfred wrote at age 14. "There came a gaunt man from the dark inn door, a dreadnought coat had he. His bones cracked loud, and he stepped through the crowd, and his boots creaked heavily. The coach of death," 1823. In 1827, Alfred and his brother Charles published a book of poems, with a few also being composed by their brother Frederick. Alfred was just 17 years old. Although the style was quite standard, a contemporary review of the book said, "The little volume exhibits a pleasing union of kindred tastes, and contains several little pieces of considerable merit. While roses boast a purple dye, while seas obey the blast, or glowing rainbows span the sky, the reign of love shall last." Poems by Two Brothers, 1827. Alfred entered Trinity College, Cambridge in 1827, and in 1830 published a collection of poems under the title Poems, chiefly lyrical. The volume was well regarded and brought him to the attention of important poets of the era. The poem Mariana is based on a character from Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. One of Tennyson's most celebrated poems, it represents the theme of despondency and isolation that was common in his work. "With blackest moss the flower pots were thickly crusted, one and all. The rusted nails fell from the knots that held the pair to the gable wall. The broken sheds looked sad and strange. Unlifted was the clinking latch. Weeded and worn the ancient thatch upon the lonely moated grange. She only said, 'My life is dreary, he cometh not.' She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead." Mariana, 1830. At Cambridge, he befriended fellow poet Arthur Hallam. The two developed a close relationship, and Hallam became betrothed to Tennyson's younger sister, Emily. When George Clayton died in 1831, Alfred was forced to leave Cambridge for financial reasons. Hallam introduced him to publishers, and largely through Hallam's efforts, Alfred published another collection of poems. But in 1833, Hallam suddenly died from a cerebral hemorrhage at just the age of 22. Emily fainted in Alfred's arms when he gave her the news. He said of his friend, "He was as near perfection as mortal man can be." Hallam's death greatly affected Alfred, and several of his most famous poems were inspired by Hallam. Perhaps most famous among them is In Memoriam, AHH, AHH being Arthur Henry Hallam. The poem, published in 1850, came at the height of his career and is considered by many to be both one of Tennyson's most accomplished works and one of the greatest poems of the 19th century. In Memoriam is a chronology of Tennyson's grief and covers a broad range of topics through that lens. Queen Victoria wrote in her diary that the poem much soothed and pleased her after the death of Prince Albert. The poem includes the much-quoted line, "Who trusts to God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw, with ravine shrieked against his creed." But the poem is perhaps most famous for its final stanza. "I hold it true, whate'er befall, I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost, than never to have loved at all." In Memoriam, 1850. In a twist of justice, Tennyson's uncle Charles published a volume of poetry that was released at almost the same time as In Memoriam, and much to his uncle's chagrin, his work suffered greatly by the comparison. Tennyson was at the pinnacle of his talent, and in 1850, when legendary poet William Wordsworth died, Alfred was chosen to replace him as Poet Laureate of the United Kingdom. Finally, finding the financial stability had been missing his entire life, he was able to marry. He married Emily Selwood, who has been a friend since childhood. The couple had 2 sons. In 1854, the kingdom was embroiled in the Crimean War. Britain's place in the war was peculiar. In many ways, the kingdom had more to lose than to gain by joining the war, but it was generally seen as a good and patriotic war, and the Poet Laureate was expected to produce verse on the cause. The imperative was even greater as the war, which was expected to be brief, dragged on, and casualties were much higher than expected, shocking a nation that enjoyed nearly 40 years without a major war. During the October 14th, 1854 Battle of Balaclava, a confused order had sent more than 600 British light cavalry into a near-suicidal frontal assault on a well-prepared artillery position. The attack had served no strategic purpose, and casualties had been extreme, with 271 of about 676 troops involved killed, captured, or wounded. Tennyson first read about the charge in the newspaper The Times. His famous poem on the charge, a patriotic ode to the bravery and loyalty of the British cavalry based on the newspaper account, and including the oft-quoted line, "Theirs not to reason why, theirs not to make reply, theirs but to do and die," was composed in just a few minutes and published in the Examiner, December 9th, 166 years ago, today. The poem did receive some criticism, both for its form and to some for glorifying war, but it became very popular, so much so that Tennyson was said to be somewhat annoyed in that it overshadowed some others of his works that he thought were superior. In fact, Tennyson seemed to be initially embarrassed of the poem, whose structure was traditional, more like poetry he had written in his youth, and some historians speculate he felt it simply too simple for the poet Laureate. The poem was initially published simply under the initials A.T. The poem was popular among troops fighting in the war, and in response to a letter written by a chaplain, Tennyson sent 1,000 copies to be distributed among soldiers fighting in the Crimea. They came with this letter. "Having heard that the brave soldiers at Sebastopol, whom I am proud to call my countrymen, have a liking for my ballad on the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava, I have ordered 1,000 copies of it to be printed for them. No writing of mine can add to the glory that they have acquired in the Crimea. But if what I heard be true, they will not be displeased to receive these copies of the ballad from me, and to know that those who sit at home love and honor them." The Charge of the Light Brigade is not generally considered by critics to be among Tennyson's greatest works, but it has become by far his most popular and well-known work. It is notable in its simplicity. Its pace mimics the chaotic pace of battle. It both laments the loss of the troops and labels them heroes for following orders. It was perfect for the Victorian era, the era of change in the Industrial Revolution, when heroism was starting to see as coming from the common people rather than just being the purview of lords and ladies. It contrasts the loyal soldier with the blundering officers. Many historians consider this poem to be the one that took Tennyson beyond literary circles to make him truly the poet of the nation, the voice of the Victorian era. Alfred Tennyson was twice offered and refused a peerage, but he finally accepted one in 1881 and was made Baron Tennyson by the Queen, an act which would have been quite distressing to his pretentious uncle, had he lived to see the day. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, served as Great Britain's Poet Laureate from 1850 until his death in 1892 at the age of 83. He was the kingdom's longest-serving Poet Laureate. In 1890, Tennyson himself recorded the poem at the request of an agent of Thomas Edison on an Edison wax cylinder.
There's not to make you mad, there's not to raise wide, there's not to do and die, and to the hallelujah, proud.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.